smoothly for our speaker. All right, well, I'm going to turn it over to our president, Eric Pritchard, to get us started. Eric.
Good morning and welcome to the 2022 Fall Convention for the Arkansas Psychological Association. I'm very excited about the program that Kyla and the Professional Development Committee put together. They did an excellent job. They did a lot of work. They reached out to some excellent speakers. And the two topics that are going to be covered and are going to be really intertwined, because they are intertwined, are two topics that are relevant to the future, not just of psychology, but to the future of our society as a whole. One is diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the other one is the way that technology is changing the profession, just like it's changing all professions. And we'll see at points that both of those topics are not separate, but they're actually also intertwined. So these are topics that are relevant to the future of our profession and the future of, like I said, our whole society. And I think that by the end of the conference, we should have at least a better idea of what sort of initiatives organizations like APA and our organization are taking to improve diversity, equity, and inclusion in psychology, and what the future of technology and psychology is starting to look like. So with that, thank you for attending, and I'm going to turn it over to Kyla, who will introduce our first speaker.
Thank you so much, Eric. Thank you. And so as Tisha put in the chat, I do see a lot of familiar names as well. So hello to everyone. Hello, thank you for being here. I wish at some point, maybe next year, we can convene in person, because I know it's great when we're able to network and see each other's faces. So it's great to see everyone, see your names. For the people that have their camera on, it's great to see your faces. Just a few housekeeping. We know some people are going to trickle in, so you'll hear me make this announcement periodically. If you're just coming in and you haven't put your name in the chat, again, that's the way we keep up with attendance. So if you haven't yet, please put your name in the chat. That's the way we know who's here. Of course, we can see it in the participants, but of course, we go back through afterwards. And Eric DeRay, our executive director, he goes back and looks at the transcript of the chat, and then that's the way he sees the name. So that's why we need it in the chat versus just in that participant box. So thank you for putting your name in the chat. Also, as we move throughout, if you have any questions, we're going to use the chat feature for that as well. So the chat box is going to be busy today, because we're going to use it for a lot of different reasons. So of course, Dr. Hintz will give you guidance about how she's receiving questions, but we are using the chat feature for that as well. We will take breaks throughout. So of course, you can kind of look forward to that. We'll announce those as they come. I just want to briefly share my screen. You all have probably already seen this, of course, but this is our brochure. So as Eric mentioned, that we are talking about looking forward, the future of psychology. And today we're focusing on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so to just transition it over to introducing our speaker, Dr. Vanessa Hintz is here with us today, and she is going to speak about the role of psychology in advancing equity, diversity, and inclusion. Dr. Hintz, gonna get to her. Okay, her bio. Dr. Hintz is a licensed clinical psychologist, workshop leader, and keynote speaker. She currently serves as the Senior Director of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Engagement and Outreach for APA. In her career, she has worked in various clinical settings with children, adolescents, and adults with a wide array of presenting issues. She is an active proponent of multicultural practice and theory, and works dynamically to understand how individuals make meaning of the world with their various cultural contexts. Dr. Hintz is also a self-proclaimed psych geek and incorporates elements of popular culture into her work when beneficial. She has engaged with practitioners and scholars in the field of academia, consultation, and training, utilizing expertise in psychology and human behavior to provide insights focused on principles of equity, diversity, and inclusion. Man, I look forward to this. I look forward. He's an expert. I like it, working with a range of people. Dr. Hintz, just to confirm, I think one of our president-elect, Marie Mesidor, said, I think she heard you speak at PLC. Is that right? Did you speak there?
I did. Yes, I did.
All right. Excellent. I don't even know if we had communicated about that, but that's the way we found out about you through Marie Mesidor, our president-elect. She spoke highly of you, loved your presentation. So we were like, hey, let's see if we can get her for our conference. So we appreciate you being here. I very much look forward to the keynote today. And I'm just going to turn it over to you. You can give us any guidance if you're okay with people having their camera on or off, however you want us to engage with you today. We'll just kind of take it from you, take your lead on that. So everybody, please welcome Dr. Hintz. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Kyla and Eric. I appreciate the opportunity. This is my favorite part of my job, actually, is to engage with folks. I agree. I wish we could do this in person because I've actually never been to Arkansas. I've been very close, but and I think I drove through a couple of times going to Louisiana, but I've never been there like to stay. And so next time we do this, we're going to do it in person. And so again, thank you all so much. I'm really excited. 3 hours is a very long time, so we're definitely going to break that up. We're going to have some of me talking, some small group discussion, and my hope is that we leave a lot of time at the end for questions, open discussion. And so with that, I'm going to pull up the presentation. I also want to Kyla's point, you engage in the way that you feel comfortable. If that means camera on, okay. If that means camera off, okay. It's totally up to you. I'm very non-directive and also very, you do what feels best for you. I will say too, it is very difficult for me to follow the chat while I'm speaking. And so I typically don't look at it. We will pause again at the end of every hour to sort of see if there are any questions that are lingering. And like I said, we'll have a lot of time at the end. And here at the very beginning of the presentation, we will do an interactive poll, which you can access either on your computer or on your phone. If you have either of those things near you, everybody has something because they're on this Zoom. And so just to sort of preface that, we'll do that here at the very beginning. And that's also a sort of mechanism you can use to submit any questions you have if you prefer to submit those questions anonymously. Because again, I want everybody to feel comfortable to engage. And if submitting those questions anonymously is what feels best for you, more power to you. And I definitely will let you know as we get into the poll how you can do that. So without further ado, let me make sure I got all my stuff together. So I can kind of see everyone. And then can someone give me a thumbs up if you can see the screen? Excellent. Thank you so much. All right, so here we go. So I'm actually going to introduce myself again in a much more intense and dramatic way as we get through the presentation, as we start the presentation. Before we do, again, I just want to extend my immense gratitude and thanks for you all, not only for the opportunity to engage with you in this space, but for getting up early and committing to being here with me for 3 hours. I'm very excited. And again, we're going to talk a little bit today about equity, diversity, and inclusion and our role as psychologists, as people, for sort of advancing these principles, as Eric mentioned, not only in our profession, but also in society, in larger society. And so these are our official learning objectives. They are there for you. If you'd like to see them, I'm not going to belabor them because we're absolutely going to go through all of this during the course of our presentation. What I do want to talk about, though, is the way that this is going to be structured. So we're going to start by casting a really wide net. So we're going to sort of talk about equity, diversity, and inclusion broadly. In the field, we're going to go over some sort of what I would call EDI 101 terms. And that's not because I don't think that anybody understands what a microaggression is or understands what the word inclusion means. It's more so to give us a shared point of departure. And so I want to, at the very beginning, sort of contextualize a lot of the terms that we're going to be talking about throughout, so that as we move forward, we sort of all have that shared understanding. In addition, we're going to talk a little bit about what APA is doing in the space of equity, diversity, and inclusion, what has been our strategy, what are some things that we're engaged in, and we're going to sort of end with basically a lived experience example of all of these things that we're talking about, focusing specifically on the association's work related to advancing racial equity. And so again, we're starting very general and getting much more focused as we move along. And again, the purpose of that sort of last piece is to really, again, give a very concrete, for lack of a better word, example of how we sort of advance some of these EDI principles as psychologists. And what I'll also invite you to think about is while we're talking through these various concepts, these various strategies, I invite you to think about not only what it means for you as an individual, whether that's your personal sort of ways of being and meaning making, whether that's you as an individual psychologist or student. And then also think about things organizationally. So thinking about the organizations in which you work, thinking about the Arkansas Psychological Association, thinking about these different organizations in which you find community, and really thinking about how EDI principles and values might be lived out and or not in these different spaces in which you operate. And so again, there are going to be times in the presentation where it seems very organizational. There are going to be times when it seems very focused on the individual. And again, I just invite you to think about all of those different levels, so to speak, as we move through our conversation today. And so the first thing I want to do is acknowledge First Peoples, acknowledge the land on which I'm currently occupying. So I am in a western suburb of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, in Waukesha. Waukesha, Wisconsin is the occupied territory of the Potawatomi, Kickapoo, Miamia, Ochete, Sakowin, and Peoria peoples. I also want to acknowledge that the APA Central Office sits in occupied territory of both the Nacotchtank and Piscataway peoples. It's important for me to acknowledge the first peoples of this land, and also to acknowledge the legacies of violence, displacement, and settlement that basically forced them from their lands. And those legacies of trauma, of inequity, absolutely reach into the present and have effects that affect us presently in our work and in our ways of being. And so again, it's important for me to sort of set that context initially. This also gives me an opportunity to share with you all a resource. So if you see on the screen, there's a phone number that you can text if you're ever anywhere in the United States and you're curious about the first peoples of the land in which you're currently occupying. You can send a text to this number. You just put the city and state in 2-letter form, and they'll send you a text right back, and they will say, this is who are the first peoples of this land. Anytime I go anywhere, that's the first thing I do, particularly if I'm preparing for a presentation, because again, I want to be sure to pay proper respect and give proper attention to the sort of, again, histories that we're still contending with today. In addition, I want to acknowledge the impossibility of separating the history of psychology from histories of colonialism and enslavement. So our field, our profession, is absolutely rooted in those same inequities that were present during the very founding of this country and are still present to this day. And so part of this is also sort of situating why it is important for us to work to advance equity, diversity, and inclusion, because psychology as a discipline is not immune from perpetuating these inequities. So I think for us to really work to make psychology accessible for all people and inclusive of all people, we sort of have to, again, work very actively to advance these principles of equity, diversity, and inclusion. And so, as promised, I'm going to introduce myself in a much more dramatic fashion. And the reason that I do this is because I think that not only as someone who works in the space of EDI, but as someone who is working to advance these principles of EDI, I bring my whole self into everything that I do. And I know that even for me, you know, I was trained not too long ago. And there sometimes is this idea that we have to separate ourselves from the work that we do. Like we have to remove who we are from the work that we do. And I actually think the opposite, quite the opposite. I lean into all of these different aspects of myself because I think that allows me to do my work authentically. I also feel like there's no time or space that I step into that I'm not bringing these things with me. And so for me, it is important to talk not only about this so that you all understand me better, but again, to sort of, I don't like the term model, demonstrate maybe that I think it is of value for us to lean into who we are. And so as I'm sort of going through my introduction and sort of the spaces in which I find community, I invite you all to consider what it is that you bring with you into spaces when you're doing your work or when you're just being. So I'm a psychologist, spoiler alert, if nobody knew. I'm trained as a clinical psychologist. My road to psychology, however, was one that was not straight and narrow. My bachelor's degree is actually in computer science from the University of Louisville. And I don't know what I was doing. When I arrived at college at 18, you know, there was this expectation that I just knew what I wanted to do with the rest of my life, and I absolutely did not. And I remember one of the student orientation folks asked me, like, well, what are you good at? I said, I'm good at math and science. And they said, well, you should be in the engineering school. Okay, great. That sounds great. It wasn't great for me. When I started doing more practical experiences, like, yeah, when we're doing calculus and all these things, like, yes, I'm good to go. Like, that's what I know. That's what I do. When it got to sort of practical coding and all of that, I hated it. I hated it so much. And I actually had a period when I was about 75% of the way through my program where I didn't know what I was going to do, because I felt like I paid all this money to get this degree that I didn't want to use because I hated it. And so after much soul searching and after much, you know, contemplation and reflection and talking with loved ones, I decided that I wanted to go into the field of psychology. And my ego told me that, well, then you just need to get a doctorate. Like, if you want to go into psychology, don't stop at a master's, just get a doctorate. And so I arrived at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology already feeling like an imposter because I didn't have a 4-year psychology degree. Those imposter feelings were only exacerbated when I noticed that there weren't a lot of people who looked like me in my program. You know, I went to school in a very diverse city, a very large, diverse city in Chicago, and our program did not necessarily reflect that diversity. And it was very difficult. It was very difficult at times. So I think that even now, being a licensed psychologist, being in a professional and having a big girl job, so to speak, those imposter feelings have not yet left me. And I don't say that to evoke any sort of sympathy, but more so to contextualize that I feel like that is with me all the time. Like feeling like I'm not really supposed to be here, or feeling like I have to work twice as hard to prove to myself and others that I deserve to be in the spaces that I'm in. And again, that's not good, bad, or otherwise. It's just more so, again, I think affects the way that I move through the world and the way that I engage in this work. I'm also a millennial, and I know that for some people it's like, I know millennials, like I'm one of those millennials with student loan debt that will probably never be able to buy a house. And it's not because of coffee or avocado toast, right? The reason that I can't, that's the situation. And I say that because, again, I think that particularly being at APA, where there is, I don't want to say a stark, but there is a difference between sort of generationally between people in leadership positions and people coming up in leadership positions. And I think that sometimes we don't necessarily acknowledge those things, particularly when we're talking about diversity. So that's one of the reasons that I think, it's important for me to share that I'm a millennial, and also because I think there's this sort of lifespan aspect of diversity or social justice, whatever you want to call it, that we typically don't talk about. So, what is progressive for me is very different than what was progressive for my father, who is like a baby boomer, And so I think that also the experiences of inequities and or, whatever are different when we think about them from a lifespan perspective. And so, again, I think it's also important that we sort of keep that chronological sort of perspective as we're talking about equity, diversity, and inclusion work. And speaking of my parents, so that bottom center picture there, that's a picture of me and my parents. So I am a Black woman with a white mom, and it took me a very long time to be comfortable identifying as Black, because I always felt like I wasn't allowed to say that. More imposter feelings, right? Like I wasn't allowed to identify as Black because my mom's like a whole white woman. And I think that sort of that tension of being biracial, I didn't really understand until I got to graduate school. And even shortly after, when I really started to study dynamics of race and racism and racial identity, and I started to understand like, oh, this is a thing. Like people have written about this thing. Black racial identity, multiracial identity. And that to me was what brought me to this space, was really seeking validation for what it was that I was experiencing. And so when I really got to the space where I was immersed in studies of race and racism was, I think, correlated with when I felt comfortable identifying as a Black woman. So I'm a biracial Black woman, and I'm married to a white man, and a white man from a very small rural town in Wisconsin. And if you would have told Vanessa 10 years ago that this was going to be her life, I would have told you were lying. Like, there is no way. And the universe had other plans, right? And so I think even, some of the things that my husband and I are confronted with, as an interracial couple now, are very similar to things that my parents were confronted with in the 80s, which is not good, bad, or otherwise. It's just sort of an interesting thing to consider. And my parents divorced, very shortly after they were married. So I don't know if it was because of whatever situations they had to deal with as an interracial couple in, Indiana. So nonetheless, the last thing I'll share with you all, which was kind of prefaced in my bio, is that I am a huge nerd. And when I say nerd, I mean like go to comic book conventions, like type of nerd, like dress up. And one thing that I started to do in graduate school, which has basically come part of my identity, is to go to these conventions and talk about psychology things, as they relate to our, popular culture. So this past year, I presented at San Diego Comic-Con, which was like one of the highlights of my life. Because San Diego Comic-Con, for those of you that don't know, is like the nerd event of the year, right? And I remember in graduate school when I really started to take this seriously, like this sort of geek psychology thing. A lot of people tell me, well, that's cute, like that's a hobby, but that's not something you can make into a career. And of course, I was like, okay, well, watch me do it. And that's exactly what I'm still attempting to do. And so all of that, I think I share, one, to again humanize myself, and two, because again, all of these things I feel like I bring into spaces with me when I'm doing this work. I also lean into these things all the time. Everybody I work with at APA knows that I'm a nerd. Everybody knows if they're watching a show or a movie, like I could talk to Vanessa about it because she's gonna want to talk about it. And again, I think that those things, I don't want to say enhance because I don't want to use that sort of hierarchical language, but they absolutely help me to be more authentic in spaces. And so again, I just invite you all to think about what it is, again, how do you show up? What are your spaces of community? What are your sort of identity factors that you feel like are with you as you move through your work? And sort of the last thing I'll say by way of context setting before we get to the poll is to talk a little bit about expectations, for lack of a better word, of our time together and our engagement in the space. And so, as I mentioned, I want everybody to engage in the way that they feel comfortable. These are just some agreements, for lack of a better word, that I'm hoping we can all sort of abide by, for lack of a better word, as we're engaging in this space today. And this is taken from the work of Glenn Singleton, Courageous Conversations About Race. We're going to talk about race today. We're also going to talk about just generally aspects of identity and equity, diversity, and inclusion. So the first thing, again, is to stay engaged. As I mentioned, whatever that looks like to you, this is a long time in the, at the beginning of the day. Some people may be at home and you have kids or pets or plants or the male person, like whatever that may be distracting you. Please do what you need to do for yourself and engage in the way that you feel most comfortable. I don't think there's a right or wrong way to be in these spaces. I also invite you to experience discomfort. Discomfort is a precursor for change. And change is sort of, as Eric prefaced, something that is constant and something that is definitely happening, I would say somewhat rapidly in our profession. And so again, I invite everybody to lean into any discomforting feelings that you may experience today. What I don't invite and what I don't ever intend to do is evoke any type of psychological harm. And so I invite everyone, if they feel harmed by something that I say or something that is communicated here, to call me up to that, and whether that is in this meeting, like, yo, that was whoa, or after the fact, because you absolutely will have access to my email address. So if anything happens that you deem to be harmful I always want to keep myself open to learning and growing. So I invite you again to engage me in conversation around that and or engage your colleagues around that if you feel harmed in any way. Speak your truth. You are one of one. There's no one else on this planet like you. There's no one else on this planet who has had your experiences and your perspectives. So your truth is your own. And I do not feel like it's my job to tell anyone that their truth is inaccurate. Your truth and your reality is your own. What I deem to be my role is to provide perspectives. And so I just invite us all to be open to hearing other perspectives, no matter how divergent they be from our own. And then lastly, to expect and accept non-closure. We didn't get to this space that we're in right now overnight. And we're not going to fix it overnight. We're not going to fix it with one conversation. We're not going to fix it with 72 conversations. And so I think if we come into this space, into this conversation with the expectation that we will likely leave with more questions than answers, I think that can help to mitigate some of the frustration that folks feel in spaces when we're talking about equity, diversity, and inclusion, because nothing is happening, right? I think if we expect and accept this is going to be a door that's opened, it's not going to close, there's not going to be any closure, I think, again, we can mitigate some of that frustration. So as promised, I want to hear from you all now. There's a couple questions that we'll go through as a group today. So there are two ways that you can join this poll. You can take a picture of that QR code if you have your phone, and if that's the way you prefer to engage, or you can open up a browser, another tab, what have you, and go to this website, slido.com. That's SLIDO.com. And then when you get to that site, it's going to ask you for an event code. Our code today is 1370407. And the first question is a ranking question. And so what I'm interested to hear from you all is, what do you feel like are the barriers that exist for folks to engage in EDI work? And so these are just some random barriers that we made up based on what feedback we have seen at APA and in the EDI office. So what do you feel like are the primary barriers, again, for engaging in this work? And as you all respond to the poll, the responses will populate on the screen. And so I'm gonna just mute myself and give us some space to engage, and then we will come back in about a minute or so. And as you all are seeing the responses come in, I again invite you to just lean into your reactions. Do you feel like this is aligned with your ways of thinking? Do you feel like, I don't know? Do you feel like people are seeing things with rose-colored glasses? Like, whatever, however you feel about the responses that you see. I just invite you to take those in. And I'll give it about another few seconds or so, and then we'll move on to question 2, which is much more open-ended. And again, as I mentioned at the outset, through this sort of platform, Slido, you can submit your questions anonymously. Any questions that you have that you prefer to submit that way, you can do it via this platform. So I just invite you to keep it open throughout the presentation. Thank you all for your participation. Appreciate it. Okay, so we're going to move on to the second question, which again is open-ended, maybe. Okay, so in a word or two, because this is a word cloud, I want to know what you hope to gain from our discussion today. So what is it that you're sort of seeking in coming into this space and then coming to this presentation? And again, these responses will appear as a word cloud. Words that you see that are bigger are ones that people share most often. So again, I'm going to mute and just give us some space to do this, and then we will move forward. All right. Beautiful. And we'll give it a few more seconds, and then we will move forward with this sort of first block of work that we have today, which is really to talk about equity, diversity, and inclusion broadly. Thank you all so much for your participation. I really appreciate it. This is sort of my virtual way of reading the room, since we're not together. So I really appreciate your participation. And so with that, as I mentioned, we're going to talk about equity, diversity, and inclusion broadly. And we're going to start by really contextualizing those three terms. And again, not because I don't think anybody knows what these terms mean, but more so, again, to give us a shared point of departure. And all of these definitions that I'm going to talk about are taken from APA's Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Framework, which I'll talk about in much more specific detail as we get into that sort of second chunk of the presentation today. So first, I want to talk a little bit about equity, which is not equality. Those are two very different things. So equity is providing resources according to need. Equality is giving everybody the same thing, regardless of circumstance, right? Equality is everybody gets the same thing, because that is, I think, what we've been socialized to believe is fair, which is part of the reason I think people's hackles rise when we talk about equity, because you don't give everybody the same thing. You give people what they need, and people have different needs. Like we could talk about the different needs that we all have, like right now in this moment. Some people may need coffee, some people may need this, some people may need that. So equity, again, requires an ongoing process of sort of assessment so that we can, again, be sure that we're being responsive to unique needs. And so, again, two things I'll invite you all to remember: that providing resources according to need piece, and the fact that equity requires this sort of vigilant assessment process. Diversity is what it is. And so, again, we can look around our Hollywood squares and really talk about diversity on various aspects of identity. So diversity, again, is sort of like what is in the space. One thing I want to say about when we talk about diversity within this context, we're really focused on social identities, and in particular, the corresponding differences in power and privilege. And so when we talk about marginalized groups, we talk about oppressed groups, we talk about historically excluded groups, we're talking about groups that are typically have a lack of power, societally speaking. And so when we talk about diversity and we talk about aspects of diversity in this space, we're talking about those social identities that have power and privilege, or corresponding sort of, you think about those dynamics of power and privilege. The other thing I'll sort of share, just sort of contextually about diversity, is that people are intersectional. You heard my whole intersectional introduction, talking about all these different aspects of my identity. No one is a monolith. No one is just one. This is my one thing. That's, everybody is intersectional. And I think we also have to remember that people's identities have different saliences in different contexts. So, for example, I'm a psychologist. I have a doctorate degree. Less than 2% or around 2% of the world has doctorate degrees, right? So that's like a big deal. At APA, I'm an early career psychologist, so that means something else. So yes, I'm a psychologist, but so is everybody else up in here. And so that means something different. And so again, that is an instance where an aspect of my identity has a different salience in a different context. Similarly speaking, I mentioned I'm a Black woman. I'm also a Black woman with very light skin. And so that has its own sort of dynamic. I'm also a biracial Black woman that has its own sort of dynamic of power and privilege. And depending on what space I'm in, there's different saliences to that, right? And so again, I think we have to remember that diversity is not cut and dry, this or that. There are intersectional things to consider. There are contextual factors to consider. What we always want to consider, though, is, again, those dynamics of power and privilege. And last thing, by way of sort of contextualizing these terms, is to talk a little bit about inclusion. Now, I don't think, like, grammatically speaking, inclusion is a verb. I always say it's like an action word, though. Like, inclusion is not something that just happens. Like, oh, if we bring all these people together, it's going to be inclusive. Absolutely not. Like, inclusion requires more than that. It requires action to cultivate spaces of affirmation, celebration, and appreciation for all people, all folks. So inclusive environments are those in which individuals feel free and safe to be their authentic selves. So I feel free and safe to walk in my truth and live in my truth without fear of being devalued. And for some people, that is easier than others because of aspects of their identity that hold power and hold privilege. I think a very recent and very current example is sort of the fight right now for rights for trans folks. There are things that trans folks have to consider in terms of walking in their truth that I, as a cisgendered woman, do not ever have to consider. I don't ever have to think about going in the bathroom and someone looking at me sideways. I never have to think about that. But for trans folks, that is a very real, very serious thing for them. And so part of the fight for trans rights now is to create spaces and create a world where they can go into any damn bathroom that they want to, right? You know what I'm saying? And so again, inclusive environments do not happen just because we wish it. They require actions. And so those are sort of like, again, the base sort of, the basis. This is gonna be the foundation and we're gonna build upon this a little bit further with our EDI 101. And so the first thing we're gonna talk about is implicit bias. And I will be wholly transparent with you all. I have a hate relationship with the term implicit bias. And namely, not because I don't think it's a thing. We're gonna watch this very short video that absolutely, it is a thing. It's a thing cognitively, like I understand that. And I think what has happened of late is that implicit bias has been used to excuse behaviors that are harmful. And my sort of retort, I guess, to arguments that, oh, it's my implicit bias, like there's nothing I can do. Once we become aware of a bias that we have, it's no longer implicit. Then it's launched into our sphere of awareness that is much more explicit. And then it becomes our responsibility to do something about that. I don't think that means it's easy. There are so many biases that I am working to overcome. So many, and it's not easy. And I don't think it is appropriate, for lack of a better word, to say, well, that's just how I am, and everybody else has to deal with it. You know what I'm saying? And so we're gonna watch this very short video that sort of demonstrates a little bit of what it is that I'm talking about. And then we'll move forward to talking about our sort of next contextual piece.
Implicit bias.
Implicit bias.
Implicit bias.
2016 was the year that implicit bias went somewhat mainstream.
Yeah, so when Hillary Clinton mentioned implicit bias in the debates, our phones started blowing up, all our friends started emailing us about it.
But what is implicit bias? Implicit biases are basically thought processes that happen without you even knowing it. Little mental shortcuts that hold judgments you might not agree with. And sometimes those shortcuts are based on race. First, some clarity. Saying someone has an implicit bias is different from calling someone a racist.
The word racist is a highly loaded term, right, here in American society. A lot of times, when people are using it, they're thinking of the kind of old-fashioned Ku Klux Klan style racist.
But implicit bias isn't anywhere near that, explicit.
Implicit bias is something that comes out of ordinary mental functioning, out of how the mind normally works.
We've all grown up in a culture with media images, news images, conversations we heard at home, our education. Think of that as a fog we've been breathing our whole life. We'd never even realized it, what we were taking in.
And that fog causes associations that lead to biases.
I somehow know that if you say peanut butter, I'm going to say jelly. That's an association that's been ingrained in me because throughout my life, peanut butter and jelly are together. And in many forms of media, there's an over-representation of Black men and violent crime being paired together.
And because of that, I actually deep down inside have been taught that Black men are violent and aggressive and not to be trusted, that they're criminals, that they're thugs.
With all those associations, I'm not trying to let us off the hook, but in some ways, none of us stood a chance.
Starting today, we'll post a video a day dealing with one challenge of understanding implicit bias and its relationship to race, and exploring ways we might combat the problem. One more thing, if you're seeing this and thinking that it doesn't apply to you, well, you might be falling prey to the blind spot bias. That's the scientific name for a mental bias that allows you to see biases in others, but not in yourself. We're biased.
Okay, and so one thing, if you all are not aware, just another resource I will share. Harvard has an implicit association test, and they sort of assess a number of different biases related to age, related to race, related to gender. There's a lot of things that you can do all of that for free, and it's something I actually used to recommend my students do. And again, not to blame. Again, I love that in this video they say saying you have a bias is not saying that you're a racist or any other type of ist, right? It's more so for us to be aware so that then again we can move those ways of thinking out of our implicit space and into a more explicit space where we can work with them again, ultimately to advance advance a society in which again people don't have fear of being judged based on their identities, right? And so moving forward, we're going to talk a little bit about microaggressions, and we're going to talk about microaggressions because undoubtedly these are the most common forms of discriminatory behavior, particularly in professional spaces, in educational spaces. You heard them talk a little bit in the video about, old-fashioned style, very overt isms. I would say that we are seeing a little bit less of that these days and more covert isms, more covert discriminatory behaviors. And again, personally speaking, the most common form of discrimination I experience is in the form of microaggressions. And so what you see on the right of your screen here, there is a taxonomy of microaggressions that was developed by Dr. Gerald Sue and colleagues. We're not going to really go into great detail where that's concerned because it's not necessarily germane to our discussion today. What I do want to sort of highlight, though, is just really providing a definition of microaggressions and then talking a little bit about some of the dynamics as they relate to our being with other people. So microaggressions occur in a relational context. They're not just something that like lives in the sphere, the existential sphere by themselves, right? They occur in relation, and we're going to talk a little bit about some of those considerations. The first thing I'll say by way of definition is that micro in this context does not mean small. Micro in this context refers to the micro level of interaction, so person to person, as I mentioned, relational. And so oftentimes people assume microaggressions are like, oh, that was just something minor. Micro means relational. And so microaggressions can be verbal or behavioral. They can be intentional or otherwise. What they have in common, though, is again that they communicate hostility, derogatory or negative sort of views about people who have a certain social identity or many social identities. And undoubtedly, microaggressions compound and they have negative psychological impacts on people who are victims of microaggressions. And so, as I mentioned, microaggressions occur in a relational context. So some things for us to consider as psychologists, as students of psychology, but also again as people who are in relationship with other people. As I mentioned, microaggressions can be intentional or otherwise. Intentional microaggressions absolutely deal with explicit bias. Unintentional microaggressions deal more with implicit bias. So again, things that people say that they may not know are offensive or can be interpreted in that way because they don't understand that they have a bias, or they don't understand, again, the lived experiences of other people, which is sort of the second point here. I think one reason that it's difficult for people to really confront biases and sort of be confronted with microaggressive behavior is that I think a lot of times folks live in very homogenous communities. So like I live in Wisconsin. Wisconsin is very segregated. Wisconsin has communities that people don't leave this 2-mile radius like their entire lives. They're in the same community their entire lives. And so again, a lot of spaces, I have a lot of students that I worked with that said, I never saw a person of color until I went to college. I had people telling me, Vanessa, you're my first Black professor of ever. You know what I'm saying? And so again, I think sometimes people who may have a certain level of privilege don't understand the realities of marginalized people in America. And so when we start to talk about microaggressions and why, it may be offensive for you to say this thing or do this thing, it is difficult for people to understand because they don't understand the lived experiences of other people. And again, that's not good, bad, or otherwise. It's just, again, one of the dynamics for us to be aware of as we work to cultivate these spaces in which we can talk openly about this type of behavior. As I mentioned, microaggressions occur in interactions. So it's not, again, something that exists without being connected to an interaction, a situation, a relationship. Microaggressions cause intense emotional reactions oftentimes. If you have ever been someone who has, and I have been, I will tell you all that story. If you have ever been accused of offending someone, or if you have ever been called up, I like to use the phrase called up, not called out. If you've ever been called up because of something that you said or you did, it is highly emotionally charged. Example, I was recently giving a presentation with some of my colleagues from APA around inclusive language. And we were given this presentation to a group of copy editors. And it was weird because the presentation, like, we recorded it. So we were there, but we were like watching ourselves on like a recording of our presentation so that then at the end we could have a live Q&A. It was so odd. Watching yourself is so odd. Anyways, there was something that I said in the context of my presentation where I used the term blind spot. And immediately in the chat, people were like angry typing, like, oh my gosh, I can't believe you said that. Like, that is an ableist term. That is just like calling someone crippled. Like, people were going in, right? And I remember sitting there, and the first emotion I felt was embarrassment. Here I am, an equity, diversity, and inclusion professional talking about inclusive language, and I sort of made that guffaw, So I was embarrassed. I will be wholly transparent with you all. Part of me, I became defensive because I feel like people were coming at me, and I'm like, oh my gosh. And I remember my colleagues, we were all sort of, in a chat together, and they said, how do you want to handle this? And I said, I'm going to take accountability because I'm going to take accountability, right? And so what I did was, when we got to the Q&A section, I apologized for any harm I caused. I didn't apologize for not knowing. I didn't apologize and say that's not what I meant. I apologized for the harm that I caused. And I also was, honest about the fact that I literally was 2 days before that presentation years old when I learned that the term blind spot can be considered offensive. It was literally 2 days before this presentation that I learned that. And I also acknowledged that that is a space of learning for me. And I made a commitment to learn and to do differently next time. That was very intense. Like, that whole thing probably took about 2 minutes, not even. But it was very intense. I was very emotional. I felt very drained afterwards. And so again, I think that for some folks, there is a resistance to engage in these sort of conversations around microaggressive behavior, because again, it's a lot, it's emotionally taxing, and we all already got a lot going on. And so that's another thing to consider. And then lastly, I would say, this consideration that our relationships, our organizations in which we live in are just like a microcosm of our larger society. And so as much as we want to rise above all of the things that are happening in our world, politically, socially, all these different things, we just can't. Like, we can't separate ourselves from that larger context. And so again, kind of like we talked about at the beginning, leaning into those things. And when I say leaning into it, I mean not pretending like it doesn't exist, not pretending like, we're not living in a society where the word equity is politicized. The word diversity is politicized, inclusion is politicized. And so again, not to pretend like those things aren't happening. Again, I think when we are talking about microaggressions and really trying to have conversations about these behaviors or things that people say, sometimes those conversations are shut down because it's like, oh, that's a political thing, we're not going to talk about that. Is it not? And even if it is, can we still talk about it? And again, those are just some things to consider. Last thing I'll say about microaggressions, particularly for folks who are practitioners, This, again, therapy, the therapeutic space is not a space that is immune from these types of behaviors. So this study that was done in 2018 noted that anywhere from 53 to 81% of people of color reported at least one microaggression from their therapist. At least half, almost 81, over 80% to over 80% of people of color said they were microaggressed by their therapist. And as I mentioned, microaggressions can compound over time and ultimately lead to a reduced sense of well-being. And so the last thing we'll do before we take a break is, again, watch this video that I feel like demonstrates a lot of what we have been talking about up until this point.
For people who still don't think that microaggressions are a problem,
Oh, you're so well spoken.
just imagine instead of being a stupid comment, a microaggression is a mosquito bite.
Ugh, it's a compliment.
Mosquito bites and their itch are one of nature's most annoying features. But if you're only bitten every once in a while,
No, where are you really from?
Cleveland?
sure, it's annoying, but it's not that big a deal. The problem is that some people get bitten by mosquitoes a lot more than other people. I mean, a lot more. Whether it's on a date,
Oh, your English is so good.
Excuse me?
going grocery shopping,
You know, everything happens for a reason.
I'm just buying apples.
commuting to work,
So when are you gonna have a baby?
watching TV,
We have to keep the Redskins name. It's part of our culture and history.
or just walking down the street with your partner.
I couldn't even tell you were gay.
Mosquitoes seem to pop up everywhere.
Do you know John? Give me shopping advice. I love Cher too.
And getting bit by mosquitoes every day,
Can I touch your hair?
multiple times a day,
So pretty. Can
Can I
I
touch it,
your hair?
please? Can I please?
is annoying. And makes you want to go ballistic on those mosquitoes, which seems like a huge overreaction to people who only get bit every once in a while.
It's just a mosquito bite. Who cares?
Just another angry black woman.
Of course, beyond just being annoying, some mosquitoes carry truly threatening diseases that can mess up your life for years.
Astrophysics? Maybe you should try less challenging, Major.
Ow, my dreams.
And other mosquitoes carry strains that can even kill you.
It looked like he was up to trouble, okay? I felt threatened.
So next time you think someone's overreacting, just remember, some people experience mosquito bites all the time.
You're all so exotic. Wow.
And by mosquito bites, we mean microaggressions.
Okay, so that brings us to sort of like the end of this first chunk of our presentation that was really focused on EDI more broadly. So what I'm going to invite us to do now is to not only take a moment to reflect, but to take a screen break. And so if you all are amenable, I would say 10 minutes. So that would be 5 minutes past the hour when we come back. If everybody else feels good about that. Excellent.
That sounds
So
good.
awesome. I will see you all in about 10 minutes. All right, welcome back all. So I noticed that we had a couple questions that came through in the chat. So before I move forward, I just want to be sure to address these and then also give space if there are any additional questions that have come up thus far. And so this first one I see, how did you learn to bring all of yourself to your work? It was quite a process, I would say. I think for me, the more I read about, you know, cultural humility and, you know, really immerse myself in EDI and all things EDI, part of what I feel like kept coming up was this idea about, again, sort of authentic ways of relating. So I think that coupled with, you know, I identify as an existentialist. And part of my, you know, training in ways of thinking and ways of being as an existentialist is that is also in the therapeutic space. What is most beneficial is for me to, I'm a whole person, and for me to be my whole authentic self in this space. And I think that it just carried through to my EDI work. And so there was quite a bit of unlearning that I had to do related to, you know, nobody cares about you. They care about what you're saying, or, you know, it's not about you, it's about this. And I often challenge that with like, it's a both and. It doesn't have to be about me for me to, again, bring my whole self into spaces. And so I would say that that's definitely how that came to be. And I see another question here. How can you have the EDI conversation without being dismissed as just a way to talk about critical race theory? Is it possible to discuss how to create an inclusive, psychologically safe space for everyone in a non-political way? This, I think, is actually a great segue to what we're going to talk about regarding the EDI work we've done at APA. But I would say that in these organizational spaces, one of the strategies is, again, to connect the work of EDI to organizational culture. So like, we're going to talk a little bit about how APA did that. But for example, when you think about Arkansas, like the Arkansas Psych Association, is there explicit mention in the mission, in the vision, in whatever related to equity, diversity, and inclusion? And if not, is that something that we want to add? And if so, that's sort of like, I think the way to have that conversation is that we're in this space, we're in this space as, you know, members of this professional organization. This professional organization promotes this. So this is how are we living that out? So I think that is in an organizational space, whether that be higher ed, whether that be, again, in different spaces that you work, that's how we have that conversation that moves it out of the political sentimental space and into a more organizational space, is by connecting it to organizational values, which again, we're going to talk a little bit about how APA did that. So before I move forward, though, I want to just pause and see if there are any other questions, comments, concerns, or thoughts that anybody has before we move forward.
Dr. Hintz, this is Kyla. I just want to just say that I look forward to your conversation about that second question. That was one of my questions, and I feel like I've seen a lot of that when working like with schools, for example, like say in education, because educational spaces seem to be, I don't know if the best word is sensitive to, or, you know, to bringing in critical race theory into the schools. And it's just like, but I like what you're saying about how to just to connect that with their values as an organization, rather than make it seem like this is a separate conversation, I guess, if that's what you mean.
Yes. And and again, that's ostensibly what APA has done and is doing. And so we're going to move into talking about that a little bit now. And I'll sort of preface this by saying, the way that we are doing EDI at APA is but one way. I don't want to promote that this is the only way that you can do it. This is the absolute right way. This is a way. This is a perspective, again, that we believe in, that we believe is rooted in psychological science. And there's a whole plethora of ways of doing this work, right? And so I'm going to talk a little bit about, again, our EDI work, our EDI framework, which again is sort of like the foundation of all that we do. And at the end of this discussion, as I referenced, we'll move into those small groups for people to just sort of discuss all that we've talked about so far. So this is the EDI team at APA. And if you'll notice, it all fits on one page. It's a very small team. We are led by our Chief Diversity Officer, Dr. Maisa Akbar. And when I joined the EDI team, there were 3 people. So I was the 4th. And since then, we've grown to have 7 folks. And it is still woefully not enough for the immense amount of work that we do. And we're making it happen. We're making it happen. And so speaking of all the work that we do, we're essentially responsible not only for EDI sort of initiatives at APA organizationally. So APA is a nonprofit with about 500 or so employees. So there's EDI work that we're doing there. And then, as you all are likely aware, APA is a member organization with about 130,000 members. So we think about building our EDI strategy. We're thinking about that as sort of like internal to APA staff and APA members. And so the EDI office is still relatively young. It was not commissioned until the end of 2018, the beginning of 2019. There was a chief diversity officer prior to Dr. Akbar taking over. She took over at the beginning of 2021. And since then, ostensibly all the EDI work and all the EDI strategies that we've been engaged in, we're building from scratch. So it's a lot. And our goal, again, is to strengthen awareness, understanding, and application of EDI in the work that we do. And we're going to talk a little bit about that EDI framework, as I mentioned. We really want to we want to operationalize EDI so that not only can we track progress, but so that we can hold the association accountable to this work. So it's not just a fleeting sentiment that we're engaged in this work, but more so something that is structural and that has sort of like a metrics for success. We want to integrate EDI across the association. We want to work to dismantle systemic inequities and continue to cultivate partnerships both internally, so like with different state associations, with different divisions, and externally with other groups, psychologically oriented and otherwise, to really increase the visibility of equity, diversity, and inclusion. Specifically, the type of EDI work that we do that is rooted in psychological science. And so what I'm going to transition into talking about now, again, is the EDI framework, which is, again, the foundation of all of our work. It sort of builds on this, and it is sort of alludes to what Kyla just referenced and what we just talked about. How do we make this part of the organizational values? And the EDI framework was the way that APA ostensibly did that. So the EDI framework, it is available for free online. You can Google it, you can read it. It's a good time. It's relatively short too. I think it's like 12 or something total pages. Actual text is maybe like 6 or 8. And so again, the EDI framework is APA's positional statement on equity, diversity, and inclusion. It's essentially a value statement. It is aspirational in nature. So when you look at it, you will notice that the things that which we're going to look at in a few moments, the things that are promoted are absolutely aspirational in nature. And again, this is the foundation. This is our foundational tool. All of the strategy that we're building is building upon the values laid out in this framework. And I'm going to go through sort of the framework and some of those values as well. And so what did APA say in terms of values and in terms of what is it that we're even trying to do? What are our aspirations? What is our North Star? So when we think about the vision, it is to cultivate, facilitate a psychology that is accessible, equitable, and inclusive for all people, and one that promotes human rights. And so when we think about, again, that is a value that APA has sort of adopted, is that we want a psychology, a psychological science that is inclusive, accessible, and equitable, and one that promotes human rights. In addition, we're sort of committed to advancing equity, diversity, and inclusion through psychological science. And both Dr. Evans, the CEO, and Dr. Akbar often say, as psychologists, as the discipline of psychology, we have a lot to offer to the space of EDI as sort of experts in human behavior and motivations and ways of being and ways of valuing. And so we really want to, again, advance a way of engaging in EDI work that is really rooted in psychological science. And so those are the commitments. Those are, again, organizationally speaking, whenever we also get into these conversations about EDI, why are we doing this? this is what we point people to, because this is the vision and the mission of the association. And so this is the EDI framework, and I'm going to sort of go through it piece by piece. One thing, just sort of generally speaking, that I'll acknowledge about the framework is, one, that it's ecological. So we're going to talk a little bit about these different levels. So what our EDI work looks like. You think about like Bronfenbrenner's ecological model. We talked a little bit about, micro levels of interaction versus macro, blah, blah. The EDI framework has that same type of ecological perspective. And it is a way to conceptualize our work. It is a framework. It is a way to, again, frame the work that we're doing, with the ultimate goal of, again, promoting accountability. Because EDI is not new. EDI is not something that just came after, 2020 when all the things happened. It's been around. I think that what has happened, though, is that, sentiments are fleeting. APA leadership turns over every year. There's a different president of APA every year. And maybe one year there is a president who is really dedicated to EDI, and in the next year, not so much. And so there has never sort of been a systemic structural commitment from APA related to equity, diversity, and inclusion. And our hope is that this framework allows us to do that. The creation of the EDI office allows us to do that. And then lastly, this framework will guide the future of our EDI planning and the building out of the strategy, which again, is sort of like the last part of our conversation today. We'll talk about some of that strategy that we've already built out related to addressing systemic racism. And so, okay, I'm going to direct our attention to the framework, sort of like the graphic that you see here. And we're going to start in the center with those 4 concentric circles. And I despise these 4 circles because there are really only 3, but they put a 4th just to confuse everyone. And so the 3 circles represent the 3 ecological levels of the framework, and those are APA, the field of psychology, and society. And so again, when we think about, again, ecologically speaking, different levels of work that we engage in, we do so internally, which again, for APA, internal means staff and also members. So member groups, APA members, like all folks, right? Then we also have the field of psychology. It's a different level, and then societally speaking. And one thing also to remember about these ecological levels is that we consider the influence to be bi-directional. So what we do at the internal level of APA will undoubtedly influence the field, will undoubtedly influence society, and vice versa. And one example that I think is evident of this bidirectionality is, again, we all remember everything that happened in the summer of 2020 concerning, the nation's racial reckoning. Very shortly after that, APA made a commitment to engaging in all this work around dismantling systemic racism. Coincidence? Perhaps. And again, to me, an example of where something that was happening societally is influencing work that we're doing at APA. Similarly, with the COVID pandemic, APA made a decision to really elevate health equity, which again, coincidence? Maybe yes, maybe no, or maybe just APA being responsive to the needs of the larger society. So again, those innermost circles, those are ecological levels. APA, the field of psychology and society, that bidirectionally influence one another. The middle sort of ring that you see there, practice, education, advocacy, and science. When we think about the work of psychologists, APA essentially breaks it down into those different domains, for lack of a better word. We have practicing psychologists, practitioners, clinicians. We have psychologists that are educators in the field of academia. We have psychologists that are advocates, maybe applied psychologists. Then we also have psychological scientists, researchers, and things of that nature. And people who do all the things, people who do all of the above, right? And so again, when we're thinking about conceptualizing our EDI work, conceptualizing the EDI issues that we're working towards, EDI issues relevant to practicing clinicians are very different than those relative to psychologists that run research labs, very different related to the concerns about promotion and tenure in the space of higher education. So again, this gives us a way to really be specific about the issues and or interventions, for lack of a better word, that we're engaged in. And then lastly, these 4 labels that you see on the outside here, the outermost circle, access and equity, cultural and emotional intelligence, psychological safety, inclusive policies and practices. Those are broad domains of EDI work. So again, when we think about what it is that we are trying to affect in different spaces, are we trying to promote equity? Are we trying to increase access? Are we trying to cultivate cultural and emotional intelligence, facilitate psychological safety, change sort of structural policies and practices to make them more inclusive? Again, this gives us a way to conceptualize what it is that we're doing. And another thing that Dr. Evans and Dr. Akbar often say is that, you know, we can't boil the ocean. There is so much to be done in the space of equity, diversity, and inclusion. And again, this framework really gives us an opportunity to break that down. You know what I'm saying? Parse that out and be very specific about what it is that we're trying to do, because there absolutely is so much to do. So that's the EDI framework in a nutshell. Again, it's sort of available for you if you want to read more about it in more detail. The last thing I'll sort of say about the EDI framework is to, again, give some examples of some of the principles that are articulated in the framework. So as I mentioned, these principles are aspirational, and again, really sort of further convey APA's values and positions in these spaces. So these are examples of principles that are articulated at that field of psychology level. So remember, we had those 3 levels: APA, field of psychology, and society. These are some things that APA is sort of advocating for to promote EDI in the field. One being to decolonize psychological science. The next president of APA, Dr. Tama Bryant, who is just a phenomenal human being. She is amazing. But this is actually one of her presidential initiatives related to like liberation psychology, decolonizing psychology. So a lot more to come where that's concerned. You know, APA also advocates for the incorporation of pedagogy about racism and its effects on health. Our colleagues in the public health sector have far outpaced psychologists in this area, really talking about the detrimental effects, excuse me, not only of racism, but of other, you know, systemic oppressions and how they affect health and well-being. And then lastly, working to dismantle institutional inequities. Again, these are all principles, all values that the association is articulating related to EDI in the field. And then we have sort of this articulation of principles related to society broadly. One being that EDI is never fully achieved. It's something that we work for actively, returning to the conversation we had earlier about expecting and accepting non-closure. This is absolutely that, said in a different, more jumbled way. Applying psych science again to the space of EDI, and also elevating and honoring the voices of people who have been historically marginalized. We're going to talk about that a little bit more as we move into the discussion of this sort of lived experience example. But again, these are all examples of values that are articulated in the EDI framework. And the last thing I want to share before we move into our sort of small group discussions is another sort of foundational resource that has come out of the EDI office that I think is beneficial. And that is the inclusive language guidelines that were released at the end December of last year. We're actively working on round 2, version 2, volume 2, edition 2, whatever you want to call it. That will likely, be released at the beginning of the year. So the inclusive language guidelines are just that. They're guidelines. They're not mandates. They're not, you better do this or else the EDI police will come to your house. Just guidelines, a resource for people that gives a perspective on inclusive language, both in written and conversationally. So the inclusive language guidelines have different entries related to different aspects of identity. So, you know, race and racism, gender and sexual orientation, disability, all kinds of things. And again, in my review of the second edition of the inclusive language guidelines, that's when I actually learned about the term blind spot. And so it's an absolutely fabulous resource, and one that we've definitely been working really hard to, you know, keep updated. And so with that, I'm going to pause because now is everybody's favorite time, which is when we'll go into our small groups. And so I'm going to actually stop sharing. I will put these questions in the chat because these are just questions if you need questions to guide your discussion. I will put these in the chat right now before we go. But I also absolutely 100% invite everybody to engage in conversation that is most meaningful for you. So if that's just talking about what we've discussed so far, if that's talking specifically about these questions, I really just want to give an opportunity to pause and have you all engage with one another. So there are the questions that I just put in the chat. I would say let's give about 20 minutes to this sort of small group discussion, and then we'll come back together. And so does everybody feel good about that? Does anybody have any questions, comments, or concerns? And again, I'll just invite us.
Everybody's auto-assigned. I'm sorry. Everybody's auto-assigned to a breakout room that I'll open up at your cue.
Okay. The last thing I'll just invite us all to remember is those ways of relating we talked about at the beginning. So engaging in a way that makes you feel comfortable, invite you to experience discomfort, speaking your truth, and expecting and accepting non-closure. So however you want to engage in this discussion, because I will say that when I'm on the other side of presentations, this is my least favorite part. We have to go in groups. And I'm also not going to creep into your groups because I feel like that disrupts the dynamic. And so I will see you all at 45 minutes after the hour. Have a great time, and we'll talk soon.
I don't know if you noticed, but go Georgia Tech.
I saw that, and I was just going to ignore it, but that's okay. That's okay. Depends on what sport we're talking about. No, it doesn't. It doesn't actually. Have they already played in football?
I have no idea. Actually, my father-in-law went to Georgia Tech, and my wife was from Atlanta. We met in Atlanta. So, and actually, we just joined SciPac, and the executive director for SciPac, her husband, big Georgia Tech, and had to go to the varsity, after coming out of surgery. So, I don't really follow college football that much. So, but yeah, I tried to, Georgia Tech fan. So,
I see you. Cool. I will be here just like checking my emails in the background, but I'll come back.
Absolutely.
Okay. Okay, welcome back. Welcome back. Wait for other folks to rejoin as well.
We still have a couple people, stragglers still in the breakout rooms, just so you know.
Okay. Okay, no worries. Not a problem. All right, welcome back. Welcome back, everyone. So, I want to just pause for a moment to give an opportunity. What you discussed in your group was absolutely what you discussed in your group. There's no obligation to share any of that. And I want to give the opportunity if there was anything that you all discussed that you feel would be beneficial for the larger group to know, or any anything that was sort of shared in the space. If you would like to bring it into this larger space, I want to give an opportunity and pause for that before we move forward. So anybody have anything they would like to share? Eric, please.
Okay. Yeah, well, I was talking a little bit. I feel bad. I was complaining a little bit. So I'm a professor and I do like my job. And there are a lot of things I like about my campus. I like my colleagues. I like my job. But there are things that also really frustrate me. And one thing that really frustrates me is on our campus in particular, I feel like anytime there are any kind of diversity, equity, or inclusion initiatives, there's so much concern about how the state legislature will see us and how wealthy donors will see us and how the town will see us, that I feel like they get stonewalled, they kind of disappear. I've seen really good professionals who've started initiatives get pushed out of the university and go to other universities. And I wonder, how do we make progress in a climate where people are afraid to even talk about diversity, equity, inclusion because it gets twisted, and we're afraid of how that will affect like our resources or funding or stuff like that. And I'm sure that's academia, but I'm sure like other institutions have the same sort of issues.
It definitely happens in APA. I would say that that's part of what we talked about, right, in terms of being unable to separate ourselves from that larger climate. And I think that some of that, which is absolutely very difficult for me, and I'm sure difficult to you, is to accept that those are the very real realities, right? Like if we alienate whoever and then we can't get funding, then we can't do our job. And, like there's a whole domino effect. And so I think sometimes what I try to do in those situations is think about the level at which I can experience some, I can have some level of control, or I can engage. So we're going to talk moving forward about, our efforts to address systemic racism. And one of the levels of racism is interpersonal. And so if I am being, if there are issues with me, engaging in work at this sort of larger macro level, what can I do here? While I still try to work to do that other thing, but I think that there's always a level at which we can operate. And I think to your point, that's only going to take us so far if we never get to that, to being able to change these systems and structures. So that definitely also happens in APA. All this work that we're doing, we get a lot of feedback, and sometimes depending on where that feedback comes from, it influences how we move, as a result. So excellent. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, well, thank you for your response.
Yeah, of course. Of course. Others? Thoughts, reflections, concerns?
Yeah, I just agree with Eric. I was in the group with Eric, and that's sort of what we were talking about. And I think just feeling words we use is just maybe a feeling of hopelessness and defeat. So that's helpful to know that, like, because it could get really overwhelming. So it may require, I don't know if you all have to do this at APA, but require just ongoing reflection and reminders of, let me just do what's in my control. Where can I start? Because it can feel very overwhelming and hard, probably a lot. So that seemed to be kind of the tone. So we were very helpful as we move throughout this presentation and this day. We hear a few nuggets that help us feel like it's something that we can do in the midst of the larger barriers. Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Absolutely, yes. I could not agree more, and I would say that that's something that I'm still working on as I try to maintain longevity in this work. Is how do you not get stuck in that feeling of hopelessness, because it's so much and there's so many barriers, and these things we're trying to undo are centuries old, and so that absolutely is I don't say daily because that sounds very dramatic, but something I experience on a daily is this feeling of hopelessness. I love that you said that, because I often feel that way also. And that's why this is my favorite part of the job, because these types of spaces reinvigorate me.
This is Pat Griffin, and we had very interesting discussion. One of our members evaluates police officers and commented, unfortunately, he's not able to join us by audio nor video. I wish he could speak for himself, but he shared dealing with police officers who have implicit bias and how he uses an instrument for them to take so that they can become aware of their implicit biases. He does screening for police officers at the state and federal level. And then we have a newcomer. There were 5 in our group, and 4 of us have known each other for years. And we have a newcomer, and Mike from New York, who is doing an internship here. And Mike, I would really like for you to just share with the group so they can see you and know who you are, because many of us have been around for years. Mike raised a couple of interesting points about the lack of norms from a diverse population, and also the fact that Arkansas is a rural state and limited access to care. So I'm going to hand the mic to you, Mike.
Thank you so much. Now I'm on the spot and big podium. Thank you for the warm reception, and thank you for this important topic and your willingness to speak. And I love what you said about discomfort, because so many friends and family members that I have don't understand the high level of training that we get in this arena of DEI training. And so I think when we lose the ability to hear alternative perspectives, ones that may make us uncomfortable, that's when conversation shuts down. And so I'm glad that you point that out about, being uncomfortable, speaking your truth, even if it may be an unpopular sentiment, because in the context of how divisive the country could have felt, or divided the country could have felt, it's important that we keep a dialogue going. So thank you for that. Yeah, it's been an interesting perspective to come from like a very populated and a very diverse area back home. My high school senior class was represented by 42 different countries. Just the senior class alone, I had access to culture and music and language and cuisine, and it's breathtaking. And I didn't realize that was not representative of the rest of the country until I left my bubble. So it's been a privilege to be here. I love Arkansas, and I'm understanding that that's a sentiment not many people share, but I do love it here because of the fact that it's rural, and we have a tendency to overlook that rural populations are also considered underserved communities. So it's been nice, and it's been an important practice for me to weave into the practice of neuropsychology, these culturally driven decisions and making people feel validated and woke and heard and trusted and trusting of us. And that hasn't always been the case. So that's where I'm at. It's tough in neuropsychology, which is driven by like very rigid protocol. And you often don't want to break that, but I think in some cases it's warranted when you want the person that you're treating to feel safe. So I hope that wasn't tangential at all.
That was lovely. Thank you. And I think anything anybody has to share is absolutely relevant to this conversation. And I appreciate you stepping up to the mic when called upon. So thank you. Is there anything, and I appreciate what you said too, because I think one of the biases that I have is this sort of association I have with the word rural and what that means. Because I was born in Indiana. I grew up in Louisville. I then went to Vegas, where I spent a lot of my formative years, and came back to Louisville for college. And I remember even now, there's parts of Wisconsin that when I hear the word rural, I automatically in my mind, I know what that is. I know who's there and I know what they think, which is absolutely not true, right? That's absolutely not true. I don't know anything about anything. But again, I appreciated hearing your story, because I think it was, again, for me, even I was making assumptions in my mind about where you came from versus where you are versus what that's like. And so I appreciate you sharing that. And again, I just appreciate this conversation today. So thank you all for your engagement and for sharing. I do want to pause just for the sake of time, because we have another little chunk to get through, and I want to make sure that we have time to take a break also. So if you all are amenable, if we can come back at 5 minutes after the hour to sort of wrap everything up by talking about this lived experience example, and then making sure we have adequate time at the end for questions. So if there are no objections, we will take a break until 11:05, and then we'll come back together and finish up. Sound good?
Sounds good.
Beautiful. I will. All right, welcome back, everyone. So what we're gonna do to sort of round out our time together today is to talk about a lived experience example. So we've been talking about equity, diversity, and inclusion, sort of broadly, aspirationally, strategically, for lack of a better word. What we're gonna do now is talk about how we put all of that into practice, and we're gonna talk about a very specific example. Again, related to addressing systemic racism, not only because that's sort of my area of expertise, but also because that's sort of work we've been doing at APA to build out our EDI strategy has sort of been in that space related to advancing racial equity. And so we're more than likely not going to get to all of this. So some of it, I will invite you all to sort of like videos and stuff to look at it in your own time. But ostensibly, we're going to talk a little bit about how we have worked to operationalize the strategy, the EDI strategy, again, related to advancing systemic racism. And this is sort of the sequence that the association has gone through organizationally to really operationalize this work. And so again, as we talked about at the outset, I invite you to think about organizations in which you work, even thinking about the Arkansas Psych Association, and how this sequence may be beneficial to operationalizing EDI in those spaces as well. So the first part of that is outlining the foundational understandings. We sort of already have talked about that related to the EDI framework. We're going to talk more specifically about that related to systemic racism. Then you establish the baseline. So where are you currently related to these foundational understandings? How close or far are you from these aspirations that you've set forth? And then lastly, you sort of develop actions related to getting you from where you are to where it is that you want to be. And again, we're going to talk a little bit about how we have worked to do that in this space of advancing racial equity. And so first, I'm going to outline some of these foundational understandings, again, as the APA sees them related to systemic racism. And so a lot of this work, and when I say this work, I mean the work in this sequence of events over the past almost 2 years now, started in February of 2021 with APA's resolution on racism that really provided a uniform definition for racism. So when APA says, "Oh, we're addressing systemic racism," this is what is meant by that. And so, excuse me, this February 2021 resolution really outlined the systemic nature of racism. And so when we talk about addressing systemic racism, we're not talking about addressing people, we're talking about addressing systems. So we're not talking about individual people, we're talking about systems and sort of the way this has been embedded in different aspects of our society. And so the definition goes on to really outline, again, operationally speaking, when we think about racism, what are the disadvantages, what marginalization do we see? What I want to really point us to is, again, something that we alluded to in the question that I believe it was Eric asked, related to the different levels of racism. And I would argue that we can think about many of the isms in this way in terms of the different levels on which they manifest. And so starting with internalized, so internalized racism is ostensibly when people of color sort of accept as truth all of the negative viewpoints around people of color, basically when you internalize those negative ideas and those stereotypical beliefs. Interpersonal normal racism is exactly what it sounds like. We talked about microaggressions at the outset. So interpersonal racism is that which occurs between people on that sort of micro level of interaction. And then we see both institutional and structural racism. And so what I want to point out from this sort of this level sort of framework of racism is that if we divided this in half, so we looked at internalized and interpersonal racism on one side and then structural and institutional on the other, this is about more than just changing hearts and minds. Internalized racism, interpersonal racism will likely be affected if we focus on changing hearts and minds. What won't be affected, though, are structures and institutions. So when we think about the work that we do to address systemic racism, there is a piece that is about changing hearts and minds. There is another piece equally as important related to changing policies, procedures, and structures. And so when we think about our work, we want to, again, think about not only the sentimentality of it, but also, again, this larger sort of systemic piece. Just a very short video, short video that I'm going to show that really sort of further demonstrates the levels, which again, I think sometimes can lead to what Kyla was referencing, just a feeling of hopelessness, because like there's so much. And I think we have to sort of have an understanding of this if we're going to move forward to try to make change. So very short video, and then we will move forward.
Structural, institutional, and systemic racism broadly refer to the system of structures that have procedures or processes that disadvantage racial minorities and particularly Black people. It refers to the rules, practices, and customs once rooted in law with residual effects that reverberate throughout society, each with their own nuances. A good example of systemic racism is redlining, a system once used by banks and the real estate industry that literally outlined the neighborhoods where people of color lived in red ink. If you lived inside of the red lines, loans were considered risky and banks were less likely to give loans or even invest. The practice was banned in 1968, but the impacts live on, preventing Black families from amassing wealth at the same rate as their white neighbors on the other side of that red line. Need proof? According to the Federal Reserve, the net worth of a typical white family is $171,000. That's 10 times greater than that of a Black family. Homes in Black neighborhoods are generally and historically worth less than white homes because the developers and businesses that make a neighborhood, well, a neighborhood, are less likely to be there. That means the tax base is lower too, which has a trickle-down effect. Less tax dollars for schools means fewer kindergarten classes, fewer qualified teachers, fewer AP classes. That leads to lower graduation rates from high school and even fewer graduates from college. This is in part caused by the school-to-prison pipeline that disproportionately impacts people of color. Institutional racism is more narrowly defined as the overt and covert forces blocking people of color from accessing the same opportunities as white people. Many of these children may benefit from additional educational and counseling services. Instead of getting the help they need, they're isolated, punished, or incarcerated. Once you have a criminal record, it invades all aspects of your life. Getting everything from a job to an apartment becomes that more difficult. Many people believe their communities are over-policed, presumed to be overly dangerous, but consider this. Black and brown people account for 30% of the U.S. population, but account for 43% of people killed by police and more than half of the incarcerated population. Institutional racism goes beyond just serving time. Something as simple as hair can be used to discriminate. Rules at school and the workplace that don't allow for dreadlocks, cornrows, and braids, they discriminate and don't take into consideration hair texture and singles out people based on their physical traits, creating rules where rules aren't needed, rules that control people of color. So, who gets to make all of these rules in society? Since America was colonized, it's been white people who've made these rules. First with slavery, then Jim Crow laws, and separate but equal rules, and even creating limits on who can immigrate into the country. The term given to define that power, white privilege. It refers to whites' historical and contemporary advantages in access to quality education, decent jobs, a livable wage, home ownership, retirement benefits, and wealth, regardless of socioeconomic status.
Okay, that video always ends so abruptly. It's like, and we're done. And so again, taking all of that into consideration, right? Thinking about, again, those sort of larger structural components. What does that look like for individual people? What does that look like in lived experience? And particularly for us as psychologists, people who study psychology, what does that mean for individuals' ways of being? And so thinking about the impact of racism on trauma. Does racism cause trauma? There are many people who argue yes, there are many people who argue no. What I would say is that the way that we clinically have defined trauma, racism is something different. Like, I think that yes, it causes a trauma, but it's not the trauma as the way it's described in the DSM. And what I will say related to that is this. When we think about the difference between racial trauma and PTSD, for example, PTSD, often there is a identified catalyst, a thing that happens that causes the trauma, that happens, and then it's not happening anymore. Whereas racism is pervasive. It does not go away. It does not go away. And also you can be traumatized by racism vicariously. So an example that I often share with people is, the murder of George Floyd. I have never seen that video. I will never watch that video. I'm still profoundly impacted by that video, and I've never even seen it. And so I think that, again, unlike other types of what we would call capital T traumas, racism is something that is very different. The other thing I would say is that no amount of coping reduces racism. No matter how many retreats I go on, no matter how much yoga, how many baths I take, whatever you want to say, it doesn't reduce racism. And so essentially what we see happening is that people develop mechanisms for coping with the racial inequities. Those work for a little bit, they become exhausted, and racism still exists, right? And the cycle goes on and on and on. So again, I do think that racial trauma is absolutely a thing. I think it is not PTSD. It is something that is very different. I'm going to invite you all to watch this video on your own, just because, for the sake of time, I want to make sure we have space for questions. But there are two psychologists in this video that talk a lot about what it is that I just said with regard to racial trauma, what it looks like and how it is different than other types of traumas. But one thing I'll say again concerning this sort of lived experience is that, again, even if you are not experiencing sort of overt racism or, like racial violence or what have you, these microaggressions, these covert instances of racism build up over time. And eventually what we see is, again, sort of a chipping away of one's sort of overall well-being. APA released this article in around the time of the summer of 2020 that pointed out these different symptoms of racial trauma, which again is not a diagnosis, is absolutely something that folks of color experience. And so difficulties establishing trust in relationships, that happens with me all the time, can be a symptom of racial trauma, emotional dysregulation, a hypervigilance concerning danger. I would say that part of my fear or my association of rural spaces is the fear of violence, racial violence in rural spaces, because growing up, those are the stories I heard. from my dad. There are things that I've witnessed driving through Indiana, and every other place you see, there's a Confederate flag, and it's just, it's a lot. It's a lot. And so again, I would argue, and APA would argue, that those are symptoms of racial trauma. And so again, these things are not, when we think about, I think sometimes when we think about EDI work, we think about it very abstractly. And I think in this instance, this is my attempt to sort of, again, bring that into the lived experience space. And again, for those of us that are practicing clinicians, as we mentioned, EDI extends into that space as well. And research continues to indicate that, this is specific to Black people, but Black people seek treatment at a far lower rate than their white counterparts. What we see then is that proliferates this norm that, well, I never been to therapy, so why do you need to go to therapy? You don't need to go to a therapist. Nobody in our family has seen a therapist. You'll be okay. And so we have young people and other folks out here struggling because they have sort of been told generationally, you don't need to do that. You don't need to tell no stranger all your business. And I would argue that part of the reason we alluded to a little bit, sort of like the lack of accessibility to services, I think is absolutely an issue for people of color and people in rural areas. Also, what we talked about earlier, the microaggressions that people experience when they do interact with the mental health system. I don't know how many of you watched Last Week Tonight with John Oliver, but he recently did a story on the mental health system in America. And it was wild when he talked about sort of all of these sort of systemic issues that have led to this broken mental health system we have, this sort of lack of availability of services. It is an amazing piece. I love John Oliver. I'm biased. I think he's amazing. But that piece, that story that he did, which I believe is available on YouTube, amazing. He talks about the broken mental health system. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about, okay, like that was sort of us setting the stage, setting the context about systemic racism in America. I'm going to talk a little bit again about organizationally, what APA is trying to do to address systemic racism. And again, going through that sequence of how we sort of operationalize this work. And so our strategy, again, we sort of have the EDI framework that is one of the foundational documents. I talked about the inclusive language guidelines. Division 45 of APA, which is the psychological study of race, ethnicity, and culture, developed a report called the Warrior's Path. That too has been a foundation of the work that we've been doing, particularly this work related to systemic racism. But this report outlines the components of an apology. So if you really want to atone for something that you did, this is what you need to do. First, you need to describe what it is that you did. Y'all know how young people, when you tell a child to apologize and they say, sorry, like, no, that's not what we're doing. We have to acknowledge what is it that we're apologizing for? What did we do? What impacts did those behaviors have? And what are we going to do differently in the future? So as we have been building out this EDI strategy related to systemic racism, those are the components that we've really been trying to address. What is it that we did? What is the impact of the things that we did? And then what are we going to do moving forward to make sure that that behavior doesn't persist? And so that, again, has sort of been our framework for doing this work. And so in October, APA adopted, I don't know what the right word is, but this apology to people of color. So this was the association's attempt to say, this is what we did. This is what we did, and this is who it impacted. Now, the apology also has an accompanying document called the Historical Chronology that really outlines, and again, all these things are freely available on APA's website, but the Historical Chronology outlines harms perpetuated on people of color by the discipline of psychology between 1850 and 2020. So not just historical harms, but harms very recently, right? And so, again, APA in October said, this is what we did, and this is how it has impacted folks. And really acknowledged their complicity in contributing to racial hierarchy. So we were complicit because we basically allowed these things to be. There was another resolution that was adopted in October that was called the Role of Psychology in Dismantling Systemic Racism. And essentially what this did was, again, aspirationally outline work that psychologists can engage in to help dismantle systemic racism. It divided that work into these broad domains, so science, criminal justice, etc. So for folks working in each of these domains, again, it basically gave some tips or aspirations as to how we could engage with in our unique position as psychologists with our expertise in psychology. How can we engage to really work to dismantle these systemic inequities? And then lastly, in October, there was a health equity resolution that really centered race and racism as the key drivers of health inequities. So again, this is one of those, another example where societal events are impacting the work that we're doing. So we saw health disparities put on full display with the COVID pandemic. And so the association felt like, okay, what is our unique positioning as a psychological association to address this? Is really to acknowledge that race and racism is a key driver of health inequity. And going back to that video we just watched, this is a systemic issue. Why don't people of color have the same access to healthcare as their white counterparts? Like about all these different things, right? And so if we want to, again, address health disparity, we have to address racism in America. And so these were our aspirational, foundational understandings of race and racism. The definition of racism that I described, the apology, the psychology's role resolution, and then this health equity resolution. All of that, those were a lot of words on a lot of different documents that basically were aspirational in nature. So none of that said, this is what we should, this is how we're gonna do this. It was all, this is what we should do. And so the next step for us in that sequence was to really establish our baseline. Where are we at in relation to all those things that we said we were going to do? We said we're going to do all these things, right? Where are we now in relation to that? And so that was what we did in a period of 6 weeks at the beginning of the year, because I don't know why. It was like a whole other dissertation for me. But we did a racial equity audit where we ostensibly wanted to, again, establish that baseline. Where is the association at concerning their racial equity efforts? What we found was, again, I think it's surprising to no, I don't want to say to no one. It was not surprising to me, but that APA has an opportunity to really diversify. And so what you see on the graphs here, the first set of graphs all the way to the left, the Council of Representatives is really the seat of power in APA. Like nothing happens unless they voted yay. You know, the council is where all the power is in the APA. So it was important for us to understand the sort of racial makeup of both the council and of APA's broader membership, also of our staff, and then comparing that to the US psychology workforce. So based on labor statistics, psychology is 84% white. And again, that is not reflective of the larger population. And so what that again told us is, again, we sort of have a baseline upon which to measure and really assess our efforts to diversify not only APA's leadership, but also the psychology workforce. What we also found was that there were a number of initiatives related to racial equity that were happening throughout APA. These initiatives, however, were not coordinated. So things were happening and you see little pockets of impacts here, there, everywhere, but that impact was not enough to sort of move the needle systemically. So maybe something cool was happening way over here, which is great, and it's kind of like a drop in the bucket because we're not sort of moving the needle again to create this sort of systemic change. So that established a baseline for us. We have an opportunity to grow our racial diversity, and you can read the racial equity audit if you want. I always tell people it's like my dissertation. I like ask people to read it, but you don't have to because there was like a whole lot. But it also sort of gave us an indication of how far we were from where we wanted to be of all those things we said in those various resolutions. So then we set on the path to really develop a plan. So now we know where we want to go, where we are, how do we get from A to B? And we wanted to develop that plan in collaboration with folks outside of APA. And by outside of APA, I mean not staff people, because APA historically has a way of just saying stuff and expecting everybody to just get in line, because this is what we said and now everybody needs to do what we said. No, that's like not what we want to do moving forward. And so the first thing we did was host an in-person event where we brought together about 40 folks. And these were psychologists, graduate students, racial equity experts and advocates, people who were not psychologists, people who worked in educational spaces. And we brought all of these people together in May in DC and really presented them with all the information I just presented to you. So here's what we said we were gonna do. This is where we are. Given your expertise, how do you think we get from point A to point B? So it was really just like a think tank, a brainstorming working session where we sort of presented folks with all of this information. And we had sort of done our own groundwork in really looking across everything that APA has said about systemic racism. And we presented these folks at the think tank with these 5 domains of racial equity work. And we put people into groups based on those 5 domains and said, hey, given your expertise in this domain, what do you think we should do? And we came out of this think tank with basically like a draft of a plan. This is what we should do in these 5 areas to move racial equity forward. We then took that draft plan to a larger group of folks in a virtual space, and we presented it to them and said, hey, this is what we have so far. What do you think? What do you think are some strengths of this plan? What are some concerns that you have? Just tell us what you think. Basically react to this thing. And we had about over 100 people at this virtual summit. I really wish in hindsight that we would have had a lot more. It was like in the middle of the day, like it was just a whole mess in terms of things I would do differently now if I could go back and do it. I would also give us much more staff so we could be able to do all the work, all the sort of supported work appropriately. Nonetheless, we brought this draft plan to these folks at the summit. We asked them to we surveyed them both quantitatively and qualitatively about their opinions. And then what we got from that then was sort of like a final version of this racial equity action plan that then had to go through all this internal APA stuff, like everyone and their mother had to look at it and say whatever they had to say. And then ultimately, we got to this final draft of this racial equity action plan that we presented to the council in August, and they passed it, which was amazing, which now makes this APA policy. So what this racial equity action plan does is it sort of outlines our priorities in those 5 domains of racial equity work, which are knowledge production, education, health, the training of psychologists, and the APA psychology workforce. And so, I'm sorry, APA workforce, not APA psychology workforce. So there are 5 domains of this racial equity action plan. Within each of those domains, there are 4 to 6 priority action statements that basically say, these are the things we're gonna do to advance racial equity in this space. And so again, that is something that is online, freely available to everyone to take a look at. And where we are now in this work is really trying to figure out how to make all of those things that we said measurable. Because we said a lot of stuff, and it's a lot of stuff. And how do we, again, create these mechanisms for assessment? How do we create metrics for success? So like one of the priority action statements is related to promoting like epistemic diversity or different ways of knowing, because so often ways of knowing that are not rooted in like objective science are devalued. So one of the priority statements is related to promoting epistemic diversity. How do you measure that? You know what I'm saying? Like that's important, like in this sort of collaborative process of developing these priority statements, that absolutely is something that is important. And what does that even look like objectively? And again, not I don't want to say objectively, how can we hold the association accountable to doing that? So that is for the EDI office, that is the space of work that we're in right now. But essentially we're following that sequence of, we have our foundational understandings, we establish a baseline, and now we're developing objectives and metrics. And so again, that was sort of like an organizational, operational journey, right? Which again is but one way to engage in this work. But it is the work that it is sort of what APA has been engaged in over the past year, two. What year is it? Two, maybe two. And so with that, I'm going to sort of bring our conversation to a close so that we can have time to get into our question and answer section. With that, I'm going to invite us all to take a moment and just sort of reflect on everything it is that we talked about today. Because again, I think I'm happy that, you know, I think Eric and Kyla sort of alluded to that this is a lot, and sometimes it can be very overwhelming. And people ask me so often, like, how do you stay committed? And I'm like, I'm still trying to figure that out. I really am still trying to figure that out. Because, you know, the work I was doing prior to this and seeing clients and teaching and all of that, that was a different type of pressure than what it is that I feel right now. Not only doing EDI work, but doing EDI work within the system of APA, which is a system that, again, is not immune to these dynamics that we've been talking about all day, right? And so one thing that I often try to remind myself of is, why am I doing what I'm doing? And for me, like, everybody has their why. For me, the answer is simple. My why is to help Black people. My why is to promote mental health within the Black community. My best friend of 20 years is a Black gay man who has attempted to take his own life because he is a Black gay man and felt like he couldn't live in his truth, in his skin. You know what I'm saying? Like, I have a younger sister who has attempted to take her life because she did not have the access to adequate healthcare, nor does she feel like people within the mental health system would understand her. And so all of those things motivate me to do what I do. You know what I'm saying? My father worked like a labor-intensive job until he was 71 years old, because we don't have generational wealth for him to not do that, right? And so everything that I do, that is my why. And again, it doesn't mean I don't care about other people. It doesn't mean I don't care about other struggles. It means that is my motivation every single day. And I feel like if I can do my part to promote cultural humility and promote equity to make the world more welcoming for Black people, it will make the world more welcoming overall. And so again, as we this is the last video we'll watch before we move into our Q&A and sort of open discussion section. But this spoken word piece reminds me, I've watched this so many times, but every time it gives me chills because it reminds me why I'm doing what I'm doing. So I'm going to invite you all to sort of just take this in. And when we are done, we will move into our Q&A section.
I was always taught to be strong in this world. Told to never let my guard down because at any moment I could be attacked without a moment's notice, that my skin made me a target. Skin that has persevered through many trials and tribulations, from seeing my mama raped by landlords, to my father being beaten and stripped of his manhood, to my brothers and sisters being separated into jobs for this bigger system. My skin has always been under attack. Yet somehow we prevailed through it all, through all the lynchings, literacy tests, new Jim Crows, war on drugs, the gentrifications, police brutalities, food deserts, mass incarcerations. We survived and adapted and pushed to change because our very existence depended on it. Our very existence depends on this Black strength. Strength that has carried us for decades, but is undermining an important aspect of our humanity and feeding in on itself. Being strong all the time took away our ability to speak about our weaknesses, our sadness, our mental illnesses. This silence is killing us. On top of that, we lack proper mental health care access and endure mistreatments by medical professionals who cannot relate to us in their practice. On top of that, we stigmatize mental illness to preserve this place of our strength, damaging ourselves, and among Black children observing a spike in suicide rates because they may feel that their place in heaven is way better than their place here today, because when Black life isn't valued enough for professional help, adequate housing, or even breathing. Life here degrades in value in comparison to life after. Black bodies, strong black souls are floating through the wind, seamlessly letting go. Strong black bodies are screaming for help, but suffering in silence and being socially and systematically being put on quiet. Black souls are strong, but we do need help when we do fall through the cracks. That is why I want you to know that you can patch things up with me. All right, we can kick it back like it was a drive-through movie in the 1970s. We can get some help from people who actually understand us, refute our standards of stigmatizing mental illness, and fight against the structures that chronically misdiagnose what this really is. Fight against the racism that brings up our mental health issues and lowers our treatment options, bringing us one step closer to seeing no other option. I want us to see that we have a way to heal this wound that has been widening ever since day one with no means of contracting. I want us to know that the seed that we sow today is the harvest we reap tomorrow. And when we finally reap, we can find peace in these moments, noticing that the danger isn't gone, but we finally have a place where it feels like it is, the grounding of black bodies.
And so with that, I want to again thank you all for the opportunity to share in the space with you today. I'm gonna stop sharing. To share in the space with you all, for your attention, for your engagement. And we have quite a bit of time for any questions, comments, or concerns. And I will also remind you that if you prefer to submit your questions anonymously, you absolutely can do so via the poll that we used earlier today. If you still have that open, I can also share it in the chat. Let me pull it up here. If you have any, again, questions that you would prefer to submit anonymously, I will stop talking and see what questions, thoughts, reflections that anybody has.
I have a couple of questions. And first of all, thank you for this powerful presentation. It's quite a bit, and thank you. Also, thank you for your powerful personal narrative that certainly added depth to this presentation. A couple of questions. Did APA involve the Association of Black Psychologists leadership during the forum? And if so, in what role when you convene the forum in May? And are you doing any work with the Kennedy Satcher Center for Mental Health Equity out of Atlanta?
Mm-hmm. So the answer to the second question is not yet. We are in the process of trying to develop like an advisory group related to the racial equity work. And I know that that name has been floated concerning, you know, some folks that we might want to consider to be part of this sort of advisory. And to the first question, I'm assuming everybody saw the Association of Black Psychologists response to the apology, which, let me say one thing. So the apology, when I started at APA, it was sort of at the tail end. So I'm getting all of this like secondhand. So some of this, like I wasn't there. And I think that what happened is throughout the development of the apology process, APA was working with leadership of all of the ethnic psychological associations. There are 5 of them, ABPSI being one. And I think that when the decision was made to move forward with the apology, ABPSI still had many concerns. And there was sort of like a, okay, we're gonna still go though. Like I think there was a conversation between APA leadership and ABPSI leadership where APA said, we hear you and we're gonna do this thing. And I think that after that happened, you know, now there is sort of this process of trying to figure out how we work together moving forward. And so we had at the think tank, there was a past president of ABPSI there. She was not there, Dr. Theopia Jackson. she was not there in that capacity though. So I don't want to say that she was there as a representative of AB Psi because she was not. And she made that very clear. I believe there was an invitation extended to AB Psi, but that was sort of the extent of that collaboration. And I know that APA leadership now continues to have meetings with AB Psi leadership, again, to talk about how we can work together moving forward. What that will be, I think, remains to be seen because of all of those political things that I try to stay out of. You know what I'm saying?
It's very political, of course. I'm going to say this, and I'm going to, the Kennedy Satcher Center for Mental Health has been doing a lot of work with policy for years. When David Satcher was, I think he was a part of the Surgeon General, he was the Surgeon General, took on mental health as his initiative. And this is something that has been built upon for years. And I'm just curious as to why APA is not tapping into these resources that have been there historically. They have a longer track record in the area of EDI than APA. Seems like that's a powerful resource there.
Yes.
That's just a comment.
I would say too, just speaking very transparently, I think APA is promoting this way of engaging in EDI that is like, there's this, I don't know if advocacy is the right word, maybe promotion of psychological science. And so I think that there are some, for lack of a better word, competing agendas related to the EDI work that we are moving forward. One being that this acknowledgement that APA is very late to the EDI game, and two, this assertion that what makes this way of doing EDI different is the basis of psychological science, which, okay, like that's sort of how I feel about it. I'm like, okay.
Which has historically been one of those institutional, systemic, oppressive components, but that's all I'm going to say.
Yes, I'm gonna stop too before I get fired. I'm gonna stop too. I see one question in the chat, but I just want to make sure I wasn't interrupting someone.
You know, the only thing that I was going to say, and I saw the question as well, is I appreciate, just like Dr. Griffin said, I appreciate your presentation. And I found myself even towards the end, I tend to do this, I'm pretty sure others do this as well, like process things kind of emotionally first, and then I have to find the words for it. So I found myself just kind of sitting in all of what you presented for a while, including the last video. So yeah, I feel like even after your presentation is done, it's more reflection to do. I think it's going to be ongoing reflection, and I encourage others to do that as well. So yeah, so I think that was my only comment, is I felt like it had me reflect cognitively and emotionally in all of those ways, and I'm going to continue to do that. So thank you.
So my question is, if we in the next couple of years have an in-person conference, will you come back? Because I wish more people were here to hear this right now.
Please invite me somewhere. Invite me anywhere and I'll come, because I've been working at home for 2 years. So any opportunity I have to go somewhere, I will happily oblige. I will happily oblige. And Kyla, I appreciate you saying that, because that's always my goal, is to just evoke reflection for people. It's not to tell people what to do. It's not to tell people how to be or what to care about. It's really just for people to reflect. And so I appreciate you saying that. It's very validating for me. And Robert, I wanna raise the question that you had concerning commenting on the struggles that college students are facing. Where do we start? I actually this past Monday had a conversation with a group of college. They were doctoral level students about imposter feelings. And I think that you know, for students of color, you know, there are these levels of systemic barriers just even to getting into college. When you get to college, if you're at like a predominantly white institution, like I went to a predominantly white institution, there are all types of barriers there. sometimes, and we talk specifically about the, the climate and culture of graduate training programs, but aspects of diversity are not always acknowledged in a way that is healthy. And so I think that for college students, again, these sort of macro level inequities that they experience because of the inequities in higher ed, because of the systemic barriers. You heard me reference at the outset how I would never be out of debt. I will never be out of student loan debt because of the amount of loans I had to take out to attend graduate school. I'm waiting for Joe Biden to just wipe those away. But I think, so in addition to those sort of larger macro level inequities, we also see, again, sort of on an individual and interpersonal level, inequities for college students. So again, there's that imposterism, there's an internalization of sort of racist ideas, because again, you're confronted with these things every day. And then again, sort of dealing with all of that while you're trying to get an advanced degree. And so I think for college students, again, I think that there's also this sort of, dealing with, power and privilege. So students can often feel disempowered by the larger systems that they're trying to confront. So you think about higher education, and students that are always, I feel like students are always ready to mobilize, right? They mobilize, and sometimes to no avail. And so I think that for anybody who works in higher ed, you know what I'm talking about. But again, I think that for, like I talked about earlier, there's this sort of lifespan aspect of this work, like what college students face versus what young professionals face versus what, school-age children face. I think there's a lot for us to grapple with. And that's why I think the framework is so beneficial, because it gives us an opportunity to really be specific about these issues that we're facing, and also ways to intervene, for lack of a better word. Others?
It's kind of related to the question about college students. Part of our conversation today as well is thinking about the future of psychology. And when I think about that, I think about like psychology training. So how would you recommend, and maybe this is in some of the documents that APA put out, but how would you recommend integrating this conversation in undergraduate curriculum programs, graduate programs? And I know they could probably be a whole other presentation in of itself, but any just kind of brief thoughts.
Yeah, so that is actually one of the domains of the Racial Equity Plan, training of psychologists. And I think that, I think back to my grad school experience where we had like 2 diversity classes that were much more, I think, content focused than process focused. And one thing I think that may be beneficial in these graduate training programs, and I think just generally speaking, but is to have more process oriented discussions. And also I think for us to elevate the importance of that when we think about even the way we build curriculum. Like, why I have to take 42 of these classes that are related to abnormal psychology, but then I have 2 classes related to diversity, like, and then you tell me that it's valuable? Like, it's not. It's not reflected in the way the curriculum is built. And so I think that that's one piece of it. We have to reflect these values and principles in the curriculum. I think also in the environment, and that is not only holding students accountable to having these process-oriented conversations, but the faculty and administrators of these training programs too. Like, before you send a faculty member in there to facilitate a conversation about equity, you need to make sure they're ready to do that, so they're not, unintentionally perpetuating these harms. And so I think that there are, and again, I would invite folks to look at that section of the Racial Equity Action Plan, but it points to, again, not only curriculum considerations, but also considerations related to graduate school climates. Because again, what the research continues to show us is that marginalized students are not finding, they don't experience psychological safety in many programs. And then there's a sort of trickle effect where you have faculty from marginalized, backgrounds. They're called upon to be mentors and therapists and all these other things to students who need sort of spaces of community, which is not a bad thing. It's just then you sort of have this fatigue, this faculty battle fatigue related to having to do all the things. And so again, I think that it's sort of like holistic in nature when we think about training programs, curriculum. You think about tenure and promotion, which is a whole other conversation. And then you sort of think about the climate of these spaces, which again, it sounds like a lot. And I think that if we break it down, which we're attempting to do, it's absolutely something that we can do if we all work together to change the landscape of graduate training. Any others? I want to also make sure we make space for people to transition because we've been here for like a long time. And so, any others?
I'm thinking
Last
if there's no other questions, I know it would be good to maybe have about 5 minutes, and I appreciate you, Becky, putting your name in there. And so we'll do a few housekeeping announcements regarding